Thanks for joining us. You've tuned into Arirang's Within the Frame. I'm Han Da-eun in Seoul. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrapped up his trip to China, a visit that came as part of Washington's efforts to responsibly manage intensifying tensions between the two superpowers. But thorny issues remain unresolved, with his visit doing little to alleviate strains. Meanwhile, a rush of significant diplomatic events are expected in Northeast Asia next month, including the possible resumption of the South Korea-Japan-China trilateral summit and Russian President Putin's visit to China, which could potentially change the landscape of regional affairs surrounding the Korean Peninsula. For an in-depth analysis of the current regional dynamics and what lies ahead, we welcome Min Jeong-hun, professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, to the studio. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure too.
We also have Mason Ritchie, professor of international politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, joining us virtually. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Professor Min, let's start off with you. How would you evaluate Blinken's visit to China and the significance of his trip?
Yes, basically I think State Secretary Antony Blinken's visit to China this time is a kind of follow-up working level talk between U.S. and China. As you know, the two leaders, President Biden and President Xi, had the phone talks a few weeks ago, and they exchanged their frank opinions about various issues like military communication, fentanyl, economic security, and climate change. And they agreed to continue to have their communication, to stably manage their relations, although they confirmed that their different opinions about thorny issues like economic security. Specifically, President Biden stressed that U.S. would continue to take necessary actions to prevent its advanced technologies from being used to undermine its national security. And I think that Blinken and his Chinese counterparts exchanged their opinions about the issues at the working level. Specifically, it is known that they reaffirmed the importance of maintaining communication at all times, and they also agreed to continue to have high-level diplomacy and interactions. I think this is what the U.S. wants most this time, because Washington needs to carefully manage its relations with China before the upcoming presidential election in November. And it is also known that Blinken called on China to exert its influence over North Korea to end its dangerous behavior and return to dialogue. And they also reaffirmed their different opinions, thorny issues like China's unfair trade practices and industrial overcapacity to global market and economic security. So overall, I think Blinken's visit to China this time made a positive impact on stably managing its relations with China.
So although tensions between the two countries simmer across various sectors, at least the two countries are trying to responsibly manage tensions, and we're at least seeing increased dialogue between the two superpowers, so that's a good sign. Professor Ritchie, Taiwan observed increased Chinese military maneuvers near its territory on Saturday, noting that 12 aircraft crossed the critical median line of the Taiwan Strait. And this came just a day after Blinken concluded his visit to China, where he reaffirmed U.S. support for the One China policy. How do you see this?
Well, in the first place, this is not a surprise. When China, chooses to do this type of sortie that crosses the MDL or other types of coercive or harassing behavior of Taiwan, it can be unpredictable. Within certain limits, but the fact that they do this strategically is well known. So the question is not so much if it will happen, but when. So it's not a surprise. It's consistent with prior behavior. Of course, the fact that it happened right after Blinken's visit is of course a way of underlining the fact that even if there's a floor currently under the relationship between the U.S. And Washington, between the U.S. and China, that ultimately China still recognizes that there's an enormous issue that they want to make certain that Washington thinks it should stay out of, and this is a way of underlining that. This is also consistent with behavior from China prior to the upcoming Taiwanese presidential inauguration. So this is a reminder to the incoming president there that he can't take Taiwan towards independence, and of course he hasn't said that he wants to do that, at least not recently. But it's a message to him that he should eventually, and Taiwan should eventually bend to the reality that Taiwan is a part of China, mainland China, and simply stop with the continuation of policies that resist that. And I think it's important to remember that Xi Jinping is ultimately still keeping the door open to attacking Taiwan. This isn't just fakery. There's some people that seem to think that Xi Jinping has learned one lesson from Ukraine, which is that attacking a neighbor state is really difficult, and no doubt he's taken that into account. But I think there's another way that you can think of him learning the lesson, which is what types of problems should one avoid. And so I think this is just a reminder to everyone, or at least should be a reminder to everyone, that Xi Jinping has not given up the possibility of at some point using an attack on Taiwan in order to compel unification with mainland China.
According to a Bloomberg analysis, South Korea would be the second hardest hit country following Taiwan if China does invade Taiwan, with the conflict shedding 23% of Korea's GDP. So it's certainly something that that's closely watched by all of us here in Korea. And Professor Min, another thorny issue that was brought to the table was Washington's concerns over China's alleged support in Russia's fight against Ukraine. And Blinken, during his visit, warned that the U.S. will take action if China doesn't stop supplying items to Russia. How concerned are you about China's alleged support to Russia?
Yes, as you mentioned, it is known that Blinken highlighted Washington's serious concerns about China's support for Russia's defense industrial base, which the U.S. argues is powering Russia's war against Ukraine. Specifically, Blinken mentioned that China is the top supplier of machine tools, microelectronics, and nitrocellulose, which is critical to making ammunitions and rocket propellants and other dual-use items. And Russia is making military weapons like rocket, drones, and tanks by using them. And Blinken also pointed out that Russia will have difficulty in maintaining its military attacks against Ukraine without China's support. So it means that China is playing a significant role in terms of the Russia's maintaining the attacks against Ukraine in the war. But the Blinken's Chinese counterpart responded to Blinken that China did not create the Ukraine crisis, and it's not a party who is directly involved in the war. And China has not taken advantage of the crisis and gained any profit. And he also called on the United States to stop unilateral sanctions against Chinese companies and stop operation against China. So it shows that China has no intention to stop helping Russia in the coming months. And I think that Russia is a very important partner for China in terms of the U.S.-China ongoing strategic competition. So China's cooperative relations with Russia will contribute to Russia's maintaining the better position of Ukraine in the war. That kind of trend will be maintained for some time.
Various reports indicate that the U.S. government is reviewing slapping sanctions on Chinese commercial banks that are allegedly involved in related transactions with Russia. So we'll have to see how far the U.S. is willing to go to address this issue. And Professor Ritchie, the South Korea, Japan, China trilateral summit is expected to be held in Seoul next month, according to various reports. If China and Japan decide to take part, What would the two sides aim to gain from it?
Yeah, so I think in China's case, clearly she would be interested in easing a little bit of China's security and diplomatic isolation. Not only does Xi Jinping have a number of issues to deal with at home in terms of some pretty significant economic headwinds that are necessitating some relatively painful economic restructuring, but in the diplomatic sphere, in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, China doesn't have a lot of friends right now, and that makes it a little bit hard for China to press forward on some of the things that it would like to advance and to move forward on some of its interests. I don't think that an attempt to alleviate diplomatic isolation is indicative of a real effort at trying to solve fundamental underlying issues. I think that we're not at that stage yet, and I think right now China looks primarily at diplomacy as a ploy or as a game in order to alleviate pressure temporarily, or in some cases, if they have the diplomatic advantage, to put pressure on others. But considering China's diplomatic relative isolation right now, perhaps most evident in some respects with the recent trilateral summit in Washington between President Biden and Kishida and President Marcos of the Philippines, it's really become evident that that part of the world has moved more into the U.S. camp and has isolated China even more. In South Korea's case, I think that President Yoon is probably looking for some fresh wind in the stabilization of relations with an important economic partner. It's important to remember how significant an economic trade and commerce partner China is for South Korea still, despite all of the efforts to disambiguate supply chains and that sort of thing. And Yoon is weakened right now, coming out of the National Assembly elections, and this is at least one way to garner some press and perhaps turn the page and open up the possibility for some positive movement with an important trade partner. So it's of course important to remember that Yoon isn't going to fundamentally undo the direction that he's going in terms of being solidly in the U.S. camp and building up the U.S.-ROC alliance, if for no other reason than that's what he believes, but also the broader population is behind him as well in that regard. But some fresh wind and stabilizing relations isn't a bad thing for Yoon. And then for Japan, Kishida's in somewhat of a similar boat like Yoon. I mean, he could clearly use some good press. His prime minister ship is on very rocky ground right now due to some scandals at home. And so I think for him as well, showing that he's trying to turn the page perhaps a little bit in some of the relations diplomatic with China is also a plus for him.
Many point out that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will likely take the chance to raise his dismal approval ratings, while Chinese Premier Li Qiang will seek to ease diplomatic isolation, with China facing various headwinds, as you've pointed out. Now, Professor Min, North Korea, of course, will likely top the agenda if the trilateral summit is materialized. How would South Korea, Japan, and China each approach North Korea-related issues?
Yes, as you know, North Korea is imposing grave security threat over the Korean Peninsula by enhancing its nuclear and missile capabilities and improving its military cooperation with Russia. And the three countries, South Korea, Japan, and China, they have different opinions and stances about how to cope with North Korea's military threats. On the one hand, South Korea and Japan, along with the United States, they are currently increasing their cooperation against North Korea's increasing military threats. Specifically, they share real-time missile warning information, and they also conduct joint military exercises regularly around the Korean Peninsula. And they also call on North Korea to return to dialogue, but North Korea has not responded to it. So the three countries have focused on currently improving their military capabilities to cope with North Korea's increasing threats. So the security situation on the Korean Peninsula continues to be grave. Meanwhile, China has been on North Korean side. It argues that it is the United States that is making the security environment of the Korean Peninsula worse by strengthening its security cooperation with South Korea and Japan. And North Korea, the small country, poor country, has tried to improve its military capabilities to just survive. So China argues that both North Korea and the United States needed to make concessions and come back to the negotiating table to resolve the problem peacefully in terms of the diplomacy. And as you know, it is known that there would be a trilateral summit meetings among South Korea, China, and Japan sometime later next month. And if the summit is held, it is likely that they will talk about the various issues, including North Korean issues, economic cooperation, and human exchange, and other things. But as I mentioned, when we consider the gap that the three countries have regarding North Korean issues, I think it would not be easy for the three countries to narrow down their perception gaps and opinion gaps and make progress about North Korean issues. And instead, they will just confirm their existing stances and opinions.
So that the three countries have stark differences when dealing with North Korea issues, but hopefully after the talks, China will be willing to play a more constructive role in taming North Korea's nuclear ambitions. I know that could be a wishful thinking, but Professor Ritchie, tensions continue to simmer between South Korea and China as the Yoon administration clearly pivoted to the U.S. in various security and economic issues. Would the trilateral summit, if materialized, help mend Seoul-Beijing ties?
I would maybe reframe it a little bit and say that if this summit takes place, it's more like putting a stamp on a decision, a provisional decision to stabilize relations for the time being. These kinds of meetings, tend to be an outcome as much as they are an input. And so, I think both sides, in some respect, have been sending signals that they are interested in stabilizing the relationship, or at least, preventing it from getting any worse. So I think that, this would be a sort of seal, so to speak, that both sides are willing to take a breath and back off from provoking the other side or from doing things that would irritate the other side unnecessarily, and instead, at least try to reach a mutual understanding on the areas where there's some type of understanding to be had, and some type of action or some type of coordination to take place. But again, I don't think any of this is really dealing with the fundamental issues. At the end of the day, President Yoon is firmly a supporter of the U.S.-ROC alliance. He is a huge supporter of the trilateralization of that alliance with Japan, and that's not going to change. And that is, from the perspective of Beijing, fundamentally contrary to China's interest in the region. For its part, China, ultimately, is embroiled in a great power competition, a great power rivalry with the United States over primacy in the region. And South Korea is an important part of that, but it's by no means the whole ball game. And so that's one less issue for China to have to worry about if it can, at least for the moment, deal with South Korea in such a way that South Korea is less threatening to China, so to speak. As I mentioned, things have taken a dramatic turn for the worse between China and the Philippines. And so, having the relationship with South Korea to continue to spiral downwards at the same time that you might see the relationship with Japan continue to worsen and the relationship with the Philippines continue to worsen is really just a scenario that Xi Jinping doesn't want to have to deal with. So, at least provisionally, I think that this type of summit would put a stamp on or a seal on an attempt to try to keep things on solid ground for the moment. But long term, this isn't going to solve anything, I don't think.
All right, we'll closely follow each country's diplomatic priorities. Now, moving on to another important part of our discussion today, Professor Min, it's now official. Russian President Vladimir Putin will visit China next month, and what would be his first overseas trip of his new presidential term? What's expected from his visit, and how would closer Beijing-Moscow ties impact the regional affairs surrounding the Korean Peninsula?
Yes, as you mentioned, it is known that President Putin will visit China next month. As you know, President Xi chose Russia as his first country to visit after beginning his third term in office. And they agreed to strengthen their strategic partnership in the summit. So it's Putin's turn that will visit China this time, and the two leaders will likely to deepen their strategic partnership further. And as the Ukraine war is prolonged and the U.S.-China strategic competition is intensified, it is expected that the cooperation between China and Russia will also be strengthened for some time. In addition, it is likely that Putin will also meet Chairman Kim Jeong-hun after his visit to China. As you know, Chairman Kim visited Russia last time and had a summit meeting with President Putin. And it was known that Putin was invited to visit North Korea. And in this January, Russian President's office confirmed that President Putin would visit North Korea in the near future. And considering that Putin visited China first and then visited North Korea in 2000, it is likely that Putin will first visit China and then visit Pyongyang next month. Meanwhile, there is a little bit slim possibility that the three leaders, President Xi, Putin, and Chairman Kim, will gather together in Beijing. You know, when President Xi and President Putin hold a bilateral meeting in Beijing, Chairman Kim could be invited, and the trilateral meeting, the summit meeting, could be held in Beijing. Of course, holding the trilateral meeting in Beijing has a much smaller probability or the chance than the Putin's separate visit to Beijing and Pyongyang. But if a trilateral summit is held in Beijing, it suggests that the three countries agreed to strengthen their cooperation, and more importantly, China will be more active to improve its cooperation with Russia and North Korea in the trilateral format. As you may know, China was rather reluctant to improve the trilateral cooperation because it had to consider its relations with the United States and its international standing. So it tried to put more emphasis on the great power diplomacy, which was focused on its bilateral relations with the United States. So still, it's more likely that China will maintain such a policy orientation, greater power diplomacy. But if China holds a trilateral summit with Russia and North Korea in Beijing this time, it shows that there is a meaningful change in China's foreign policy orientation. So we'll see what will actually happen next month.
All right, another key diplomatic event to keep close tabs on. Thank you, as always, Professor Min and Professor Ritchie, for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And that does it for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time tomorrow. See you then.